This is Jerry. So a lot of you asked me to do a very in-depth video on China. The West, in all its wisdom, our government officials, our media, they don't understand. In any system, it doesn't matter if it's a monarchy, a dictatorship, a democracy, a communistic anarchy, whatever. There's going to be factions and people vying for power. A government is never, ever unified. So, with this being said, let's explore China. China, in its upper echelons, is like the Game of Thrones. In fact, since Game of Thrones is about to come out, I will use some Game of Thrones analogies to explain all of this to you guys. So let us do this. But before we do this, let's go back a few years to when President Xi, the current emperor president of China, took power. He launched a corruption probe, and let us look at how the West reported it. This is CNN.
Stealing state secrets and abusing
Top Chinese abusing power.
Was one of the most trusted advisors to former President Liu Jintao. He served in a role similar to that of chief of staff. His indictment, part of an enormous corruption
crackdown. Notice this guy was part of the previous president's. China anti. This is from Financial Times. Anti-corruption purge hit Central Committee. 18 Central Committee. Most elite political organizations. Until it's disbanded. 205 members. 9% have been detained. What's the 9% were they that were detained? Let's look at CBS. It's all corruption, right? It's about corruption.
The Chinese government from small towns to megacities.
Megacities, huh? We're going to get into that soon.
President Xi Jinping is just 2 years into a 10-year term, but he's taken dramatic steps to consolidate power by cracking down on corruption. More than 80,000 Communist Party members have been investigated so far.
Whoa. Consolidation of power. They almost got it, but they didn't go into it. I don't know if they're scared to, or they don't understand. So guys, before I go into this, let's explain how the Chinese government works, because this will really enlighten you as to how this Game of Thrones plays out. So one of the first things I have to explain to all of you guys is that China is not a dictatorship. Get that through your heads right now. Remember, China's not a dictatorship. The Chinese government works like many other non-dictatorial governments. There are layers and layers and layers and layers. And within every layer, unless you have people on your side, on your team, there's going to be pushback. There's going to be potential for conflict and factionalism. One thing to know right now is it's not like in America where the president is also the commander-in-chief. In other words, the president is also the leader of the military. That's how America works. That's not how China works. In China, you could be president, you could be the leader of the military, but it doesn't always work that way. So that's one thing to know. Second thing to know is that the president has about 7 close advisors around him. Sometimes this number has changed, but in the recent years, it's been 7. It's called the Standing Committee. The Standing Committee of these 7, the president cannot do much without these 7 people. So that's an important layer around the president that you must have people on your side. And we'll explore later is that it hasn't always happened in some presidential administrations. And then, of course, there's other parts of the government, like there's a big national Congress, forgot what it's called, and there's the state level, et cetera, et cetera. But that's not important. All you have to know is that there are lots of different layers. Before we get into details and make the Game of Thrones analogies, I wanted to give you guys a rundown of who the presidents have been, because in the past, I've seen major publications get it wrong. Mad Magazine, in one of their issues, got this president wrong. To get on the same page, we have to at least know these 4 people. We're gonna know more people later. So this guy, Deng Xiaoping, he is part of Mao's era. So Mao tortured him, I think purged him at least twice. He almost got killed, but eventually Mao died and he survived and he consolidated power and he became the next president. There were a few interim presidents in between Mao and Deng, but he was president. He was like the real consolidated power president after Mao. After Deng was Jiang Zemin. A lot of you have probably seen clips of him. He blew up at Hong Kong reporters back in the day.
你们我感觉你们新闻界还要学习一个，你们非常熟悉西方这套的魅力，你们毕竟还图洋，明白这意思吧？我告诉你们，我是身经百战了，见得多了。西方的哪个国家我没去过？ 媒体他们，你们要知道，美国的华莱士那比你们不知道高到哪里去了。我给他谈笑风生。所以说媒体啊，还是要提高自己的知识水平。懂我的识得不识得啊？我要给你们着急啊！真的，你们我以为偏地，你们有一个好，全世界跑到什么地方，你们比其他的西方地方跑得还快。但是呢，问来问去的问题啊，就 too simple， sometimes naive， 懂了没有？
那江主席，
知道不知道啊？
但是能不能说一下为什么支持董
我很抱歉，我今天是作为一个长者，给你们讲讲，我不是新闻工作者，但是我见的太多了，我有这个必要好告诉你们一点人生的经验。
He was kind of a character. He was very different from a lot of these other leaders because he kind of had this clownish type of other ulterior side. And then after Jiang Zemin was Hu Jintao. One of the biggest memories a lot of you might have was when he came to visit Bush, and Bush pulled him by his suit jacket. So that was Hu Jintao. And then this is the current president. Some people compare him a little bit to looking like Winnie the Pooh. This is Xi Jinping. He's consolidated power, and he also abolished the 10-year presidential limit in the Chinese constitution. So remember, Deng, Jiang, Hu, and Xi. So these are the four we have to know. In the TV series and the books, there's positive and negative associations associated with these houses. From anyone that's at a certain age in life, everyone has a little bit of evil in them. Everyone has a little bit of good in them. And just like the American system, whether you're a Republican or you're a Democrat, if you're in power, you're in power. You want to expand your turf. Anyone watching from China, just because if I call you a Lannister, if I call you a Stark, if I call you a Baratheon, don't take the negatives and the positives of those houses from the series Game of Thrones at face value and think I'm comparing you exactly that way. Before we begin, let us recap what happened on Game of Thrones. Remember the Baratheons, the Starks, the Lannisters, the Targaryens. Originally, Mr. Baratheon here, this guy, started a rebellion with the Starks, and eventually the Lannisters joined, and they kicked the Targaryens out of Westeros. So the Game of Thrones is basically all the houses, who gets to sit on the throne, etc., and different sides playing each other, who's in alliance, who's not in alliance. It looks like this person is coming back, and they might fall. They've already fallen, and they are on the upswing too. When we make this analogy in comparison to Chinese government works, it's not exactly going to follow some of this, but I tried my best to make the comparisons kind of funny and kind of accurate. So let's move on to the Chinese equivalents. This might look intimidating, but we will approach this one at a time. The first thing I'm going to talk about is the Targaryen equivalent in China, and that's this mofo down here. So I'm going to put this down now. For a while, China wasn't communist. Until 1949, China was ruled by this mofo. Not a very good ruler, but he at least tried to embrace capitalism, and he listened to America. In the 20s and the 30s, and even in the 40s, there was a lot of tension in China because China overthrew its last dynasty. So there was lots of anarchy. Eventually, this guy, Chiang Kai-shek, took over with his dragons, aka foreign help. A lot of blame is placed on him for not ruling China well, but I don't think all the blame can be given to him. China was just a really hard to rule place. It was too factionalized. Somewhere along his reign, the communists emerged. Russia was communist, the Soviet Union. Communism was spreading all over the world. So naturally, in a country like China, where there was huge inequality throughout history, communism would have a very, very big appeal. He led what are called the nationalists, 三民主义. So he led the nationalists, the Kuomintang, or the Kuomintang, as white people say. So the Kuomintang and the communists fought each other. The Japanese took the opportunity to invade, and eventually the Japanese got kicked out after World War II, and then the communists and the Kuomintang, they continued the Civil War. 1949, he got kicked out of China, aka Westeros, and he ended up in Taiwan. And the Republic of China is still in Taiwan till this day. Much like in Game of Thrones, there's always that Targaryen threat very far away across the sea. In China, there's always the Taiwanese question. Those Targaryens, the Kuomintang descendants, are always kind of a thorn in the side of the current ruling party in China. Now that we have explained the Targaryen equivalent, the Republic of China, aka Taiwan, we won't talk about them again because they have a very on-the-side role here now because they don't rule mainland China anymore. So we're really going to look at this. By the way, this is such a cool picture. This is President Hu, this is President Jiang, and this is President Xi, the current president. One of the rare pictures of them standing together. And if you look really closely, look who's not smiling, look who's smiling. I'll explain that to you in the future. We will really focus on these three. This is where the meat and the fun of it really comes. So let's go. So the next step would be to explain what these terms mean. Because you might see these terms, you'll be like, what? So let me explain what this means. Princelings. What does Princelings mean? The Chinese equivalent of this is 太子党. That's what usually it's called in Chinese. Basically, the Princelings are the descendants, the kids, the grandkids, maybe the great-grandkids of the original communists that founded China, that helped shape what China was in its first few decades, so to speak. So these are the Princelings. Why is it called the Princelings? Because those were the people in power, and now they are in power again, so it's like an imperial or a feudal system where the people in power will make their kids in power, their grandkids stay in power. So that's why they're called the Princelings. It's kind of a satirical, or maybe it's a way of criticizing a lot of these people, saying that they are only in power because their parents, their grandparents were influential. Maybe it's a way of saying they lack the ability, they aren't the best people to rule. Whatever the case, that's usually what they're called. Now, I call these guys the Younglings. I don't know exactly what their translation in English is, but these are the people, their parents, their grandparents could have been part of the group that took over China. Doesn't have to. But what distinguishes them is that many of them have very high degrees. Many of them have much higher education than their equivalent Princelings. And many of them probably are a little bit more idealistic / pro-reform. So if you want China to be even more democratic, you want China to be even more free market, these people have a higher likelihood of working with you a little bit. I'm not going to judge the evil / goodness of these two because I don't know. The position I have on this channel that many of you who have followed me for a long time know is that people are inherently self-centered, people are inherently self-interested. So no matter what ideals, power corrupts, and people want to stay in power. That being said, the common consensus is these people in the Chinese government are probably more likely to reform China, for better or worse, reform China from its current system, whereas these people want to keep the status quo because, again, their families have been in power since the beginning. Now, what about this, the Shanghai Clique? What exactly are they? To explain what the Shanghai Clique is, I have to go back to the previous board when we talked about the different presidents. So anyone that studied Chinese history knows that this President Deng was very pro-reform. He opened up China in the late 70s, and China's GDP, China's standard of living just grew a lot. He's very pro-reform. He's very pro-free market. He was tortured by Mao. He kind of knows Mao's system doesn't work. But he also is very realistic. He survived all the craziness under Mao. So he's not going to do anything too drastic or too naive. But he wants to take China in the direction, maybe you could say more west. So he's starting to reform the government. He's even starting to have more free speech. And for those of you that have ever heard about or seen that picture of the tank, it happens under his administration, 1989, in June. students all over China. Most people don't realize that it happened all over China, not just in Beijing. Beijing was the most reported because all the reporters were in Beijing, but all over China, students were protesting. High educated, super sheltered, super idealistic, you could call them stupidly naive students, were trying to bring China more modern, bring China more towards the 21st century, bring China more like the West. The point is, they wanted reforms under President Deng to happen quicker. They felt like it wasn't quick enough, man. They're the current generation. They're the future. They felt like they were being inhibited. Whatever their reasons were, you could say the West planted them. Some people say that. The key is, they started protesting. In Deng's mind, he's the president. He needs, one, to cling to power, and two, he needs to keep China. He's feeling like, oh, first of all, this could get out of control. The West could ride this and do more bad stuff to us. But he's also thinking, look, I'm going down this path of reform, and what's it led to? Sure, China's getting a little richer, maybe the West respecting us more, but look at our young generation. What are they doing? They're not respecting their elders. They're not doing what they're supposed to do. They're rioting. They're turning their backs on everything, on tradition, whatever. Eventually, he acts, and all over China, every big city where there are student protests and riots, students get detained, some of them get shot. And of course in Beijing, made a big deal. Students got ran over, soldiers got killed too, big riots. And then you have that famous picture of Tank Man, etc. After this happened, there was a lot of purges in Deng's government. He decided, okay, maybe some of these very pro-reform people in my government that I was listening to, maybe they're not right. They caused this, man. It's their fault. Deng, very famously, house arrested, purged Jiang, if you guys have heard of him. Jiang was purged along with a lot of pro-reform people. Li Peng, a more pro-status quo guy, kind of won out the power struggle. And that is where he emerges. What happened was, out of all the cities in China, the city that should have rioted the most was Shanghai. You know why? Because even before China overthrew its last dynasty, Shanghai was already this bustling metropolis. It represented everything about the West. It was the Manhattan of the East. It had all the corruption, all the lust, all the capitalism, all the non-Chinese values, all the foreigners, all the trade. Before any of this, Shanghai already had all of that. Shanghai was, I don't know at the time if it was the biggest city, but if there was one place with all the crazy Western influence where the students should have done crazy stuff, where it should have been riots, should have been Shanghai. But he was the mayor, he was ruling Shanghai at the time, and under him, nothing happened. Shanghai was one of the only cities where there was nothing. No protests, no student riots, nothing. As Deng was purging people and then trying to thank and promoting people that helped control all these protests, he looked at this big corrupt city of Shanghai and he said, wait a minute, dude, you must have been doing a good job, man. Your city was kept under control, whereas everywhere else in China, it looked like a bomb was going off. Mr. Jiang here, Lannister Jiang, and the reason I make him a Lannister is because Shanghai, capitalism, the Lannisters always pay your debts, Lannisters, money hungry, etc. I thought it was a funny analogy. I'm not saying that's what he is, and I'm not saying that's what his clique is, but it's just a funny analogy. He suddenly gets in the favor of Deng. So eventually Deng's reign as president is starting to end. He's thinking, who should be the next president? Well, he seems to be able to control China. He seems to be able to find the right balance between going forward, but also keeping some of the status quo. So lo and behold, Jiang Zemin becomes the next president. And the reason it's called the Shanghai Clique is, as we've talked about before, if you're the president of China, you need people around you on your side. You can't do anything by yourself. That's what nobody seems to understand in the West. As he starts consolidating his power, as he becomes president, he starts promoting all the people that ruled Shanghai with him, all his friends, all the people that scratched his back, all the people that he scratched their backs. All of his Shanghai cliques start becoming more and more powerful and ruling with him. Some, if not most of the Shanghai clique, involved some kind of relationship, if not directly were Princelings. Much like how in Game of Thrones, the Baratheons and the Lannisters married to kind of cement power, there's a lot of that going on between the Shanghai clique and the Princelings. In fact, some people would say Jiang Zemin, President Jiang, was actually a Princeling, but I don't think you can really say it like that. There's a lot of debate about Jiang's early life. In fact, some people, whether to discredit him or it's actually true, said that his father was actually part of the collaborationist government after Nanjing fell to the Japanese. Although President Jiang's uncle, I believe, was a war hero, he doesn't trace his lineage directly to some kind of founding member or founding revolutionary of the Communist Party. That's why I would disagree with some of the sources that you might be able to read up that call Jiang a direct Princeling. But it is no doubt that because the Shanghai clique had many Princelings and Jiang probably identified more with the Princelings than the Younglings, during Jiang's administration, he would of course build more alliances and walk closer with the Princelings than the other side, the other faction. What you'll see is the trend in Chinese politics, the people in power before aren't going to just let go of power. Even Mr. Chairman Deng still kind of held the reins of Jiang for many years. So eventually, Chairman Deng died in the 90s. He died, he was just too old. That's when Jiang really finally kind of consolidated power and took over completely. But even when he was consolidating power and when he was president, he couldn't rule completely for a few years because Chairman Deng still clung on to power and Chairman Deng still had many of his OG people in power around President Jiang. So as President Jiang is consolidating his power, remember in the administration, there's still these people. Think of the administration during Jiang's time as a clash between these three. There's more factions, of course, but we're just going to focus on these three. It's happening all the time in China. But of course, the West doesn't understand this, right? The West, especially in the 90s, oh, China's this dirty communist country. We need to contain them. If you remember, guys, during Jiang's administration, very famous incident happened with President Bush. The spy plane incident, remember that? We demand our pilots back. Bush was so cowboy about it too. Yeah, we were spying on you, but you better give us back everything, man. World police. China was starting to rise. Compared to the 80s, GDP kept growing. I mean, the China miracle looked like it was going to keep happening. So it really gets interesting here to the next president. From my understanding, Deng really wanted Hu to be president after Jiang. So there was nothing Jiang could do to prevent him from being president because he already wanted that. But he's consolidated power, and Hu is not part of his Shanghai clique. So he's not going to give power away easily. He spent years building his own power base. He has so much greatness. I believe his son also owns one of the biggest Chinese companies. The point is, there's a lot riding on what he's built. He's not going to just give away power easily. Notice President Hu was in power during the 2000s. That's when the China miracle really happened. A lot of Chinese people, a lot of Westerners that weren't just completely biased by old Cold War thinking really had a lot of faith in him. And he was also a youngling. So internally, I think a lot of Chinese people had a lot of hope for him too. They thought, oh my God, if there's one president that's going to take China to the next level, it's going to be him. He's going to reform China more. But the vested interest right now as he's taken over is to keep the status quo. All of these guys' people, his henchmen, are in power around him. So what are some of the funny things that are happening while President Hu is in power? Even though he was president, President Jiang for many years kept himself the commander-in-chief. So he was still leading the military, even though he was president. So for a while, a lot of people were like, yeah, what can he do if he's still the person that's in charge of the military? So after a while, I don't know if there were deals being made or he kind of slowly took over from him, but he eventually relinquished the president of the military position and gave it to him. So the West at the time thought, oh, okay, that means he's taking over, man. He's the next dictator of China. Remember I talked about how there's a standing committee around the president? The president cannot do anything without his standing committee. I believe when he was president at the time, there were 9 standing committee members. It was him and 9 other people, and they would rule China. 6 out of 9 members of the standing committee. I could get the number fuzzy. It might be more than that, but I think it was 6. 6 out of 9 members of the standing committee that he needed to rule China were his people. The West didn't realize, I think everyone in China knew it at the time, who really was in charge. Who? But who really was in charge during the time when he was president? It was him. It was him. He couldn't do much. He tried. I'm sure he's consolidating power. He's clashing with them, but not able to do anything against them because everyone that's around him is basically under this guy. So it's really complicated. A lot of people blame him for not being able to do anything or not doing enough, etc., during his reign. How are you able to do much if you're fighting these guys internally and you're fighting these guys? You got 2 powerful factions that are preventing you from doing what you want to do. The reason I put Jon Snow here is because his reign as president was kind of like Jon Snow under the Night's Watch. Just his hands were cuffed. He couldn't do much. I mean, he tried. If you look at Jon Snow under the Night Watch, he did still show a lot of progress. He showed a lot of potential, but still his hands were tied because he was under the Night Watch. He had all these people, all these factions vying for power, everyone kind of limiting him. And towards the end of his reign, I think his power got more and more. But look at how the West treated him, because the West doesn't understand there's these factions. The West thinks they're all the same. They're all dirty communists. They're all people who are our enemies. He goes to visit Bush in America. Bush pulls his jacket, treats him like a little kid. How much soft power damage is that to him? All these people are looking at him being like, you can't even be respected by that stupid president of America. In everyone's mind in China, Bush's IQ was so low that he had to dig for it, right? That's people's impressions of Bush.
These are big achievements for this country, and the people of Bulgaria ought to be proud of the achievements that they have achieved. A fine host for the OPEC summit. I appreciate APEC summit, you know.
God bless America.
Thank you, Rolling. That's awesome speech. The fact that they purchased the machine meant somebody had to make the machine. And so when somebody makes a machine, it means there's jobs at the machine-making place. I remember meeting a mother of a child who was abducted by the North Koreans right here in the Oval Office. These immigrants have helped transform 13 small colonies into a great and growing nation of more than 300 people. The people in Louisiana must know that all across our country there's a lot of prayer. Prayer for those whose lives have been turned upside down. And I'm one of them.
Cowboy who has to dig for his own brains because that's how dumb he is bullying you. And then I remember Time magazine came out with this front page, one of their issues, the most evil men in the world, and he was on the front page. He's part of the most pro-reform faction of China, and he's being called the most evil man in the world. Very bad soft power damage for him. If the leaders in the West knew about all this, I just, part of me feels like they did know about this. I just don't think some guy like me knows more than our leaders in the West. If you really wanted a more pro-West China, you wanted a China that might embrace Western values more, you have to really reach out to this faction of China. So when he was president, should have really helped him, should have really supported him. Let's recap what we learned. In the 1990s, the Lannisters were ruling China. In the 2000s, the Starks were ruling China. There's a difference between the Starks and the Lannisters, and of course the whole time there are Baratheons in the administration too, and the Starks and the Lannisters and the Baratheons are always vying for power, sometimes collaborating, etc. The West does not understand this. A Stark faction in power is probably the most pro-West out of all the factions that are currently ruling mainland China. The West is treating the Starks, the Lannisters, the Baratheons like they're all a bunch of Unsullied, or they're all a bunch of White Walkers. They don't understand the differences, they don't understand the motivations, they don't understand anything. So from a policy perspective, from a diplomatic perspective, you missed out greatly in the 2000s because you didn't understand the Starks were different from the Lannisters, and the Lannisters were different from the Baratheons. So now let's talk about Xi, and let's talk about what happened after the Starks' reign's over. Before the water break, we know that during his presidency, this guy was basically still in charge. So let's go from here and learn a little bit more about how this guy wielded influence. This guy right here, part of the Shanghai clique, his name was Zheng Qinghong. So he was vice president under Hu, but he was part of him and his clique. And in fact, from my understanding, President Jiang probably really wanted him to be the next president because it would have been easier, right, for him to hold on to power. Kind of like when Putin made Dmitry president. Well, Dmitry's still Putin's person. So he's vice president, very powerful already. Imagine the vice president's not really on your side. Kind of like in early America when Jefferson was vice president and John Adams was president. It's not really like that, but I'm just giving you guys some examples, some case studies to think about. The very interesting thing about this guy was he wasn't completely a Shanghai clique because he almost has like a Littlefinger / Varys type of vibe to him. In some ways, he helped Jiang stay in power and helped Jiang control him, but in other ways, he actually really helped him slowly consolidate power over him. So one of the reasons some people say that he relinquished his commander-in-chief power and slowly lost power is actually because of him. So it looks like this guy is kind of shifting his loyalties. Littlefinger, selfish, right? Varys is more like he has maybe the interest of the kingdom in mind. So I don't know if he's more of a Varys or a Littlefinger. On top of that, he also was helping them too. His connection with the Princelings is that he was also, besides part of the Shanghai clique, he was kind of part of what's called an oil clique. Basically, he was really close with some of the top leaders of the oil industry. In fact, I believe this guy and this guy all had something to do with that. So he's helping his buddies in the oil clique. So he's lots of different loyalties, lots of different sides. No one knows what his real motivations were. And then who are these two people up here? Well, we know they're Princelings, right? Because they're in this category. And we know that this was the next president of China. But it wasn't always clear that this was going to be the next president of China. In fact, just like any faction, for example, in America, the Democrats have their own rivalries. The Libertarians inside the Libertarian Party have their own rivalries. The Republicans have their own rivalries. Inside the Princelings faction in China, there's, of course, different sides. So he was vice president for a while, and eventually Xi, the current president, became vice president under Hu. Some people thought, okay, well, that kind of means that Xi is going to be next in line to be president, but there were actually a lot of people in support of this guy. This guy's name is Xilai. So remember in the beginning when I laughed because one of the Western media outlets talked about megacities and how the megacities were getting cracked down? This guy was the mayor. He ruled one of the biggest megacities in China. So this guy was the guy who ruled over Chongqing. Chongqing, for those of you who've seen past videos of mine, you're probably familiar. Chongqing has about 30 million people. It is a humongous city in China that most Westerners don't know about. What is Chongqing? Chongqing's a city very, very west in China, but the reason it's such a big city is because it's got the Yangtze River next to it. Chongqing has a very unique history because after Nanjing, aka Nanking, fell to the Japanese in World War II, the government at the time, remember that Targaryen guy, Chiang Kai-shek? He moved the capital of China to Chongqing. So Chongqing was the capital of China for a few years. And so Chongqing is a city that was very built up from the beginning. Many Chinese cities, when it rains, it kind of floods because the sewer systems can't handle too much rain. Chongqing is one of the few cities that doesn't flood because it's got a different design, probably a German or American or some other kind of design for its sewer system. So there's an old kind of saying that some of the former KMT, the Kuomintang, the Kuomintang big cities in China are the only ones that don't flood when it's really, really lots of rain. But that aside, Chongqing has always been this metropolis, and under Bo, to his credit, Chongqing grew a lot. Chongqing was a model for kind of a new way of building wealth and building cities and still having socialist principles. So Bo was really popular. And Bo had a lot of supporters, including this guy. This guy's name is Zhou Yongkang, and he was the head of security, I believe. He's basically, you can consider him the third most powerful person in China. And he was also part of the oil clique that I talked about. So Bo had a lot of supporters. So now we got the Princelings have a rivalry. We don't know who is going to be the next president after who. He's attacked on all sides. He can't really rule well. And this guy was sometimes helping him, sometimes helping them, sometimes helping him. And eventually he resigned. So he's out of the picture eventually by the time a lot of this crazy stuff happens. So one of the things that happens towards the end of Hu's reign is that Bo gets in a lot of trouble.
But the star of the show is putting up a feisty defense. Bo Xilai is charged with corruption, taking bribes, and abuse of power. His wife Gu Kailai has already been sentenced for murdering British businessman Neil Hayward. Bo is accused of using his position to cover up the murder. His former police chief Wang Lijun has testified against him, but in court Bo fiercely called him a liar.
Any of you who followed Chinese news approximately half a decade ago probably remember this. This guy's police chief of Chongqing ran away from Chongqing with the police tailing him. He rushed into the American embassy in Chengdu, my hometown. Chengdu is the capital of Sichuan, which is right next to Chongqing. So it's about a 2-hour drive. So the police chief under him rushed into the American embassy in Chengdu. And the reason why he went to Chengdu was he knew everyone in Chongqing was against him, so he needs to be far enough from Chongqing. So he rushed into the American embassy in Chengdu to seek asylum. And eventually he wasn't granted asylum, but it was a very, very dirty case that eventually took him down. And I'm not going to tell you guys the specifics because I don't know enough details, but the gist of it was his wife somehow took part in killing a British person. A British business person was somehow, it's claimed, killed by his wife and some other people. He goes down. Everyone within the southwestern sphere of China, so all the people in Sichuan, all the people in Chongqing that had his back or he had their back, all of them slowly go down. Since Zhou Yongkang was part of his crew, he goes down too. All of this is happening while it's the end of his administration, is transitioning to that. A lot of what President Xi was doing during his anti-corruption probe was getting rid of all the people that were supporting him. There were a lot of supporters of him, man. So it was a big purge under the guise of anti-corruption. Remember in the beginning, that CNN report where they got that official's name wrong? So the guy's name is Ling Jihua. And Ling Jihua, you could say his protege or a person really close to him. So now that you know that, part of his anti-corruption was, of course, to get rid of all of his followers. On top of that, he has to get rid of any remnants of this guy's followers. He's taken out rivals within his Princelings clan. He's taken out rivals in the Younglings clan. And he's taken out rivals in the Shanghai clique. That's the real reason for his anti-corruption. There's probably some real anti-corruption to it too, but that is definitely not the primary reason. And of course, I'm oversimplifying it. There's a lot of maneuvering between all three parties, and he threw his support behind him, partly to take out him, but then he also gave his support to him, and he also gave his support to him because they wanted to take out him. So there's a lot of back and forth dealing, a lot of backstabbing, a lot of temporary alliances that I have not the time nor the research to really explain it all to you correctly. But the point is now, this is no more, absolutely no more. I don't know how much influence these guys have, or they're very, very weak in the Chinese administration now. And these guys have completely taken over under him. So that, in a nutshell, is where Chinese politics is now. Xi wants to be president for life. But if you've been paying attention this whole time, you probably realize that just because he changed the constitution and he's going to be president for life doesn't mean it's guaranteed. There's always factions, maybe not these same factions anymore, but there's always going to be factions within his Princelings clan. There's always going to be factions that emerge that are different. It's always going to be a Game of Thrones at the top. So if there's anything you learned from this, It's that politics is politics. It's not different in Saudi Arabia. It's not different in Ghana. It's not different in Norway. It's not different in China. Politics is politics. It's people with their own self-interest, sometimes with the interests of other people, but it's people fighting for resources, turf, and influence, and their visions, etc. So if there's anything as a policymaker, as an academic, as a media person in the West that you can learn from all of this, is that it's no different in China. Don't treat them as one entity, these crazy communists or these corrupt communists or these evil communists. There's some evil people, there's some good people, there's a lot of in-between people, and you really have to understand the nuance of it all. My channel's about nuance, and I hope I gave a little bit of nuance. I don't have a stake in any of this. I just like to learn. I like to think. I have no interest in politics. I see how much the people interested in politics, the people interested in policy, seem to not get basic things right about the world. If there's any word of encouragement I can give to people in the media or people in politics, it's just that. Spend a little bit more time doing some research. It's not that hard. It just takes a little bit of digging. Or it takes a few friends that can tell you a little bit. And I think that's it, man. That's a primer. That's an intro. I honestly don't even have an interest to talk more about this. I feel like I've done the best I can. If you guys, my audience, or someone else really want me to explore this more, you can. But at this point, I'm going to tell you guys, you better be pledging on Patreon or donating on PayPal, or else I'm not going to talk about this more. This stuff is complicated, and it's not my primary interest in life. So, my fellow audience, my fellow 钻石王老五, thank you guys so much for watching. I learned a lot from this. I know you guys learned a lot from this. And we will be exploring more nuances in the world. If you're new to this channel, please subscribe. You'll get a lot more in-depth stuff like this. It's not always politics related, but it is a lot of nuance related stuff. We will talk soon, and leave your comments below, especially those people who've also done research, or maybe you're from China or something, or you've been involved in the government or whatever. I'm really curious to hear your explanations and your additional details to all of this. For those of you who are fans of Game of Thrones, who do you think is going to end up on top in the HBO series / the books? Talk to you guys soon. Bye-bye. 我曾经问个不休，你何时跟我走？可你却总是笑，一无所有。我要给你我的追求，还有我的自由，可你却总是笑，我一无所有。你何时跟我走？你何时跟我走？告诉你我等了很久，告诉你我最后的要求，难道在你面前的我总是一无所有？只是你的手在颤抖，只是你的泪在流，可你却总是笑，我一无所有。Bye.